Welcome to What's Law Got to Do with It? An online civics tutorial for students in 7th grade. Click Next to get started. You live in a society of laws, and this tutorial will help you learn all about them. By the end of this tutorial, you should be able to recognize the sources of our laws from ancient times to the present. You'll also learn to identify the different types of laws found in the American legal system. And you'll examine different legal scenarios to put your knowledge to the test. Let's begin. Click Next. Let's review the basics about laws and why we have them. Anytime people live together and form communities, rules become necessary. What if there were no rules? Try to imagine playing a game with no rules to go by. People would probably cheat and do whatever they could to win. Most of us don't want to live in that kind of community where the sneakiest people win. We'd rather establish some rules which may limit some of the things we'd like to do, but actually free us up in other ways to live the best lives possible. For these reasons, and many more, governments create laws, the official rules for a community. Laws keep people safe and promote the general welfare, the common good, for society. Laws also protect the rights of individuals. For laws to be effective, a society must have what's called rule of law. This means that the law is applied fairly and equally to everyone. Think of the law as the glue that binds a society together. The laws we have today in the United States trace back to many different sources. Maybe the earliest is Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi was an ancient king of Babylon who reigned thousands of years ago. The code that bears his name is probably the earliest known written collection of laws in human history. It lists 282 laws dealing with criminal and civil situations, along with the penalties for breaking each one. The laws deal with issues like trade, marriage, military service, theft, even murder and slavery. Let's look at a few of Hammurabi's laws in detail. Law 22. If anyone commits a robbery and is caught, then he shall be put to death. Law 196. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. As you can see, Hammurabi's Code was a little harsh compared to our modern laws. But even if these particular rules don't apply to today's world, it's important to recognize their influence on the law in the modern world. By putting the law in writing for all to see, Hammurabi created a clear legal system of rules that apply to all of society, an early constitution. You might say that under this code, Hammurabi's Babylon had rule of law for his era. Now that you've learned about an ancient source for the law, let's shift to a more modern perspective on the laws we actually use in American courtrooms today. In the United States, there are generally 3 different sources for our modern laws. They are statutory law, case law, and common law. We'll explore each in detail on the slides coming up. Statutory law includes any law that is passed by a legislative or lawmaking body. These laws are called statutes, from which statutory law gets its name. Statutory law is created at every level of American government. Federal statutes, called acts or laws, are made by Congress in Washington, D.C. State statutes, usually just referred to as statutes, are made by state legislatures, like the Florida legislature in Tallahassee. And local statutes, often called ordinances, are made by local legislative bodies like a city council or county commission. Statutes are created for any number of reasons. Generally speaking, statutes are created to forbid certain actions. A no trespassing sign on public property would be an example of this. Or statutes might require certain actions. For example, public buildings are required by statutory law to post the locations of fire exits in case of an emergency. Another source of law is case law. Case law isn't made by a legislature, it's based on the previous decisions and outcomes of other cases, including those decided by the United States Supreme Court. The legal term for this is precedent. When a case is decided by another court, especially a high court on the federal level, its decision becomes a precedent or a model for other courts to follow. The legal principles that come from precedents are what makes case law. A good example is the landmark Supreme Court case Gideon v. Wainwright, decided in 1963. Clarence Gideon was arrested and tried for theft. The Sixth Amendment to the Bill of Rights guarantees all Americans accused of a crime the right to have counsel, a lawyer, to help them through the legal process. But Gideon was extremely poor and he couldn't afford a lawyer, so he had to be his own lawyer in court. Not surprisingly, he lost. But Gideon appealed his case to the Supreme Court, claiming that his constitutional rights had been unfairly violated. In a unanimous decision, the court agreed. They explained that the Sixth Amendment guarantees the accused the right to a lawyer even if he or she cannot afford one. This decision created new case law. Based on the precedent of Gideon versus Wainwright, every state is required to provide the accused with a court-appointed lawyer, if they request one, at no cost. If a situation similar to Gideon's ever came before another judge, they would know immediately how to rule, because case law has settled this particular issue. As you can see, case law by its nature is constantly changing. As time moves on and society changes, so do court decisions and the precedents they create. But since the decisions of the Supreme Court are final, and the court rarely overturns its own decisions, a case like Gideon versus Wainwright will probably exist as case law for a very long time. A final source of modern law is the tradition known as common law. This refers to any legal decisions or principles that are based on tradition, custom, and precedent. When the English colonized America before the United States existed, they brought with them certain customs and traditions known as common law. Generally speaking, these laws weren't necessarily written down anywhere. Instead, they were passed down to each generation and practiced as the accepted norm, and most became part of American law because of this nation's English heritage. In the U.S., for example, much of the basic law concerning contracts and property has never taken the form of statutes created by a legislature. Instead, they exist as common law precedents. Just like in case law, precedent plays a major role in common law. When judges decide a case like a contract dispute, the actual law might not be there for them to consult because it doesn't exist. Instead, judges almost always consult rulings on similar cases, some of which may go back many years or even decades. Then they base their ruling at least partially on these prior cases. In this sense, the ruling of courts say and always have said what the law is, and create a body of common law for future courts to follow.